From the time she was very young, the girl's presence seemed to glow with an unassuming gentleness, the sort that even the breeze seemed to pause for. She was no more than 14 years old, her body thin from lack of nourishment, but her spirit carried an innocence that seemed untouched by the cruelty she faced. Her days began with the first light of dawn, when the roosters crowed and the village stirred to life. While others rubbed the sleep from their eyes and reached for bowls of porridge, she rose quietly, her stomach already twisting with emptiness. Food was the one thing always kept from her. Her stepmother would ladle out steaming meals for her own children, smiling as she placed bread and stew in their hands, while the girl's bowl remained empty. "You've eaten enough," the stepmother would say, though it was a lie, for the girl had eaten nothing at all. Her step-siblings echoed this cruelty, laughing as they licked their fingers clean and left scraps in sight, taunting her with what she could not have. The girl's hunger was not only for food. It was for affection, for kindness, for a place in the hearts of those around her. She longed to sit by the fire at night and hear her name spoken with warmth, but instead she was spoken of as a burden. Every day she swept the dusty floors of the hut, gathered water from the stream, carried firewood that weighed heavier than her fragile frame should have been forced to bear. Her stepmother gave commands without care for her exhaustion, and her step-siblings mocked her thin arms and hollow cheeks. The villagers, too, saw her struggle, but they turned their eyes away. Some whispered that misfortune followed her, that she had been born unlucky, and so they offered no help when they saw her stumble under the weight of a water pot or saw her quietly nibbling on wild berries she found near the forest's edge. Each night, when the household feasted, her hunger was sharpened by the sounds of chewing and the clattering of bowls. She would sit by the corner of the hearth, clutching her empty stomach, breathing in the scents of roasted yam or spiced millet stew, and dream of just one mouthful. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she licked the crumbs left behind on the grinding stone, or pressed her lips to the rim of an abandoned gourd to taste a drop of porridge. Her stepmother caught her once and slapped her so hard the sting burned her cheek for hours. "Animals scavenge scraps," the woman spat. "You should learn your place." Yet the girl's spirit, though weakened by her body's frailty, did not break. In her hunger she found strange patience, an endurance that others could not understand. She noticed things no one else did, the way the wind whistled through the cracks of the hut, the way the stars pulsed like watchful eyes in the night sky, the way silence sometimes seemed to hum with hidden voices. Her longing for food became a longing for something greater. Justice, freedom, recognition of her humanity. Her hollow stomach was only one part of the emptiness forced upon her, for she was denied not just bread but belonging. Children in the village sometimes mocked her as she passed, calling her the Hollow One or the Starved Shadow. They laughed at the way her steps dragged, at the way her clothes hung loosely on her frame. She lowered her eyes and said nothing, though inside her heart bruised with every insult. Still, there were fleeting moments when her kindness shone through. Once, a small boy tripped near the riverbank, his hands full of figs. The fruit spilled into the water, and though she longed to eat even one, she chased after them, pulling several from the current and handing them back to him. The boy's mother thanked her with words but offered no food in return. The girl simply smiled weakly, though her stomach growled in protest. At night, when she lay alone on her mat of straw, she whispered her hunger into the darkness. She prayed silently to ancestors she had never met, asking them why she had been born into such neglect. She begged for a dream where she could taste warm bread, where she could feel full just once. Sometimes her body ached so badly from emptiness that she curled into herself, trembling until sleep finally came. In those dreams she often saw a table set before her, laden with food she had never tasted, golden fruits and steaming pots. Yet just as she reached for them, the vision would blur, and she would wake with the same ache gnawing at her belly. Her stepmother relished this cruelty. Denying the girl food was not simply about saving portions for her own children, it was about control, humiliation, and ensuring the girl knew she was unwanted. To starve her was to erase her slowly, to weaken her until her existence seemed fragile enough to vanish. But what the stepmother could not see was how this suffering was shaping the girl into something she could not yet comprehend. Hunger taught her endurance, and neglect carved strength into her soul. Though her hands trembled when she lifted heavy pots, though her ribs pressed against her skin, there was a flicker inside her, small but unyielding, that whispered she would not always be the one denied. The villagers, blind to the cruelty, gossiped quietly about her thinness, some wondering how she still lived with so little to eat. A few muttered superstitions, saying perhaps unseen forces kept her alive. Others scoffed and said she was simply too stubborn to die. The girl heard these whispers, and though they stung, she carried them within her silently, adding them to the weight she already bore. Her hunger grew each day, sharpening her senses until the sound of a cracking nut or the scent of roasted maize seemed to echo louder than the drums on festival nights. She endured it, step by painful step, unaware that this hunger, both for food and for dignity, was shaping her destiny. For though her stepmother, her step-siblings, and even the villagers denied her sustenance and kindness, the very emptiness they forced upon her was planting the seed of something they could never control. A power that would not only feed her soul but turn her into a force her enemies would one day regret creating. The cruelty of her stepfamily was not hidden, not subtle. It was deliberate and sharp, meant to pierce her deeper than any blade. Food, the simplest mercy in life, became a weapon in their hands. Each morning, when the pot of porridge simmered and its fragrance filled the air, the girl would quietly approach, hoping, just hoping, that a small portion would be set aside for her. But instead, her stepmother would glance at her with narrowed eyes and ladle out bowls only for her own children, filling them so generously that the porridge dripped over the sides. The step-siblings laughed as they slurped, smacking their lips exaggeratedly, looking at her thin body hunched in the corner. "See how sweet this tastes," one would taunt, holding up a spoon just out of her reach, then swallowing it down before she could blink. Sometimes, her stepmother would order her to serve the food. The girl's hands trembled as she carried steaming bowls, the aroma almost dizzying in its richness. She had to set them in front of her step-siblings while her own stomach growled so loudly that even they laughed at the sound. Once, a half-eaten yam rolled off the table and landed near her feet. For a moment she thought it might be kindness, but before she could pick it up, her stepmother snatched it and threw it into the fire, glaring at her with venom. "Better the flames eat than you," she spat. That small act of cruelty stung worse than the hunger itself. It was not just denial, but rejection so pointed it carved into her soul. At night, when the family gathered around bowls of soup, they exaggerated their enjoyment. They licked their fingers noisily, groaned with satisfaction, and tossed bones onto the ground where she sat sweeping, as though daring her to gnaw on them like a dog. And though she longed to pick one up, the shame of being treated as less than human burned her more fiercely than her empty stomach. She would instead lower her eyes, her thin hands clenching the broom tighter, and swallow her hunger like a bitter stone. The cruelty extended beyond mealtime. Sometimes her step-siblings would hoard food, hiding pieces of fruit or bread in their sleeping mats so they could pull them out in front of her later. They would bite into the fruit slowly, letting the juices run down their chins, making loud sounds of pleasure. Then they would toss the peels at her, laughing when she didn't flinch, though inside the hunger gnawed like an animal tearing her apart. On worse nights, they smeared leftover stew on their fingers and waved it near her nose, watching her nostrils flare at the smell. "Beg," one said once, smirking. "Beg and we will let you lick it." She turned her face away, though her body shook from weakness. Her silence was her only shield, her refusal the last scrap of dignity she possessed. The villagers, too, played their part in her torment. They knew she was being starved, for they saw how her ribs pressed against her thin skin, how her eyes seemed too large for her face. But rather than offer compassion, many turned her pain into gossip. Some laughed, saying, "She is cursed. Why waste food on someone marked by misfortune?" Others muttered that her hunger was deserved, that she must have sinned in some unknown way. The cruelest of them pointed her out to their own children, saying, "If you do not behave, you will end up like her, hollow and pitiful." These words cut into her heart even deeper than hunger. To be denied food was one thing, to be denied compassion was a cruelty far heavier. The injustice of it all was like a constant storm cloud over her days. She worked harder than anyone, fetching water until her arms trembled, grinding millet until her palms blistered, gathering wood until her back ached. Yet when it came time to eat, her labor earned her nothing. Her stepmother claimed she was undeserving, that she ate up resources without giving anything in return. But the truth was plain, the girl gave endlessly and received nothing. Even the small scraps a stray dog might find were kept from her. At times, the cruelty turned into open humiliation. During one feast day, when the village prepared roasted meat and spiced stew, her stepmother purposely called her to carry the largest dish through the crowd. The scent was overwhelming, her stomach churning painfully as the heat rose into her face. Just as she placed the platter down, her step-siblings began chanting, "The starving one carries the feast. The starving one carries the feast." The villagers laughed, and her stepmother smirked as though the ridicule was a game. She stood frozen, cheeks burning, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. That night, after all the food was gone, she returned to the hut and sat beside the ashes of the fire, her body trembling from emptiness. She scraped the blackened pot with her finger, hoping for a taste of flavor, but even that was taken from her when her stepmother snatched the pot away and poured water over the ashes. "Not even the scraps are yours," she hissed. The girl's hunger became more than physical. It became a daily reminder of rejection, of her place outside the circle of warmth and care. Every denial was a wound. Every taunt was salt pressed into it. Her stepfamily's cruelty was not accidental, not careless. It was intentional, meant to strip her of dignity, to remind her that she was unloved and unwanted. And yet, though the injustice grew heavier with each day, she bore it with a quiet endurance, her silence deep as the river. Her hunger, sharp and unrelenting, was shaping her into something they could not yet imagine. What they thought was weakness, what they mocked as frailty, was slowly transforming into a force that would rise against them. They starved her body, but in doing so, they awakened the part of her that would one day make their cruelty the very cause of their downfall. Her nights were the hardest to endure. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the village fires flickered in the distance, the girl's world became one of shadows and silence. She would curl up in a corner of the hut, her stomach knotted with hunger, the faint ache spreading like fire through her thin frame. The emptiness was not just in her belly, it was in her soul, in the way the air around her seemed to weigh heavy with loneliness. She could hear her stepfamily laughing in the other room, the clinking of bowls, the sound of spoons scraping against pots, and her throat would tighten until tears pressed against her eyes. Yet she refused to let those tears fall where they could be seen, because she knew even her sorrow would become their mockery. The nights of faintness dragged long. Sometimes, when the hunger grew unbearable, she pressed her palm against her stomach, whispering softly as though speaking to herself could quiet the growls inside. She would close her eyes and imagine food, not just the plain yam or porridge she once ate, but feasts of roasted meat, steaming stews, and ripe fruits glistening under sunlight. In her mind, she could taste the sweetness, feel the warmth of nourishment filling her. But when her eyes opened, all she had was darkness and the cold hard floor beneath her. The contrast between dream and reality cut deep, and the ache of despair grew sharper. Yet even in that despair she found a strange kind of resilience. When others might have broken, she turned to quiet prayers. Her lips moved silently in the darkness, words carried upward like smoke rising from ashes. She prayed to the ancestors she had never met but whose presence she sometimes felt in the hush of the night. She whispered her pain, her hunger, her longing for kindness, and in return she felt a subtle stillness wash over her. It was not food, not comfort, but it was enough to remind her she was not entirely forgotten. Her stepmother had locked her heart away from compassion, her step-siblings mocked her suffering, and the villagers turned their faces from her pain, but in her prayers, the girl carved out a place of strength that no cruelty could touch. Some nights she thought she might faint and never wake again. Her body weakened with every day of denial, her steps growing unsteady, her breath shallow. Lying in her corner, she could feel her pulse fluttering faintly, like the wing of a trapped bird. Fear would rise in her chest, fear that she would vanish quietly, swallowed by the shadows, and no one would even care enough to weep for her. But then, just as the panic grew unbearable, she would remind herself to breathe slowly. She would whisper, "I will endure. I will not let them see me break." Those words, simple as they were, became her anchor, holding her steady when despair threatened to sweep her away. On nights when hunger sharpened into agony, she listened to the silence around her. At first, it was empty and cold, but gradually she began to notice things within it. A faint stirring of the wind against the walls, a soft rustle as though unseen hands moved in the darkness, the distant cry of a night bird that seemed to call only for her. These sounds became her companions, strange whispers of a world beyond the cruelty of humans. She began to believe that perhaps forces she could not see were watching, perhaps spirits of the land and sky lingered near, keeping her from collapsing completely. The thought alone brought her a small measure of hope, as though she were not entirely alone in her suffering. The faint glow of moonlight sometimes slipped through cracks in the walls, falling across her face as she lay still. On those nights, she imagined the moon was a guardian keeping watch over her, bathing her in silver light that seemed to say, "You are seen. You are not forgotten." In the silence of hunger, in the ache of despair, she found strange comfort in these small signs, the shimmer of light, the whisper of wind, the pulse of her own quiet strength. Her suffering was silent, but it was also filled with endurance. She refused to scream for mercy, refused to beg for scraps, refused to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Her silence was not weakness, it was defiance. Every night she survived without food was a victory they could not erase. Every prayer whispered into the dark was a seed of hope planted deep within her soul. She told herself that the night would not last forever, that hunger, sharp as it was, could not break her spirit. Her loneliness, her faintness, her despair, these became her trials. But within them she discovered that there was a resilience she had never known. She did not understand it fully, not yet, but each night of silent suffering was preparing her for something greater. The unseen forces she prayed to, the whispers in the night, the glow of the moon, all of these hinted at a power that waited to be revealed. For now she was only a girl sitting alone in darkness, starving and forgotten. But in her silence something was stirring, something strong, something unbreakable, something that would one day turn her suffering into a nightmare for those who had laughed at her hunger. Her body had grown frail, her bones jutting sharply against her skin, her strength almost drained by endless days of denial and nights of emptiness. Yet it was in that weakness, when her body could give her nothing more, that something new began to stir. On one such night, when her hunger pressed so heavily against her ribs that she thought her breath would stop, she closed her eyes and tried to let her spirit float away from the ache. At first there was only silence, the kind of hollow stillness she had known for many nights. But then, gently, almost imperceptibly, she heard it, a whisper. It was not a voice that came from outside. It was not her stepmother mocking her, not the villagers' laughter echoing in her memory. It was a voice so soft it seemed to rise from the air itself, sliding into her ears like a breeze through tall grass. She startled, thinking her mind had conjured it from her suffering, but then it came again. A murmur, steady and ancient, speaking in a tongue older than the village itself. The sound wrapped around her, not frightening but strange, so strange that her trembling body stilled, her ears straining to catch every syllable. The whisper grew clearer, and though she did not understand the full language, she felt its meaning. Child of suffering, child of silence, your hunger will not consume you, it will transform you. The words filled her chest like warm smoke, and for a moment the ache in her stomach seemed less sharp. Her eyes fluttered open, and she saw the faintest shimmer in the air, as if fireflies had appeared in the cracks of the walls. She blinked, and the lights danced before her, forming shapes that reminded her of faces that were not human but carried a familiarity she could not explain. Ancestors, perhaps, or spirits older still, watching from beyond the veil of the living. At first she was afraid. She drew her knees close and whispered, "Am I dreaming? Have I gone mad from hunger?" Her voice shook, but the spirit's reply came with a calm certainty that silenced her doubts. "No, child. We have waited. Your suffering has opened the door. Through hunger the body weakens but the spirit awakens. You are ready." From that night onward, sleep no longer brought her only pain and weakness. Dreams came, rich and vivid, filled with colors she had never seen, skies painted in strange hues, and rivers glowing like fire in the dark. In those dreams she walked with shadowy figures who carried staffs, beads and crowns. They looked at her with eyes that burned like embers, and each time one of them touched her, she felt her hunger twist into something new, a spark of power, fierce and frightening, humming in her veins. Some nights she saw visions of her enemies, her stepmother and step-siblings, laughing as they feasted. But in the vision, when she reached for the food, it turned to ash in their hands. Their laughter crumbled into coughing, their mouths filled with dust. She woke from such dreams with her heart pounding, realizing these were not ordinary imaginings, they were promises, glimpses of a justice that was taking shape. The whispers did not cease. They came at odd moments, when she drifted near unconsciousness from hunger, when the night wind slipped under the hut's door, when her breath was shallow and she thought she might not wake again. "Endure a little longer," they said. "The fire is growing in you. Your hunger is not your weakness, it is the forge." She clung to these words, repeating them under her breath like a chant, until they became more nourishing than food. The girl began to notice changes within herself. Though her body was frail, her senses sharpened. She could hear footsteps from far away, feel the shift of air when someone passed outside, and sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she saw faint flickers of light tracing patterns in the darkness. These patterns formed symbols, spirals, circles and marks she had seen carved on old stones in the village square, symbols her grandmother once told her were the language of the ancestors. She did not know their full meaning yet, but she felt them etching themselves onto her soul, like instructions whispered through time. One night the voices grew louder. Instead of whispers they became a chorus, low, rhythmic like the sound of drums deep beneath the earth. She lay still, tears sliding down her cheeks, not from sorrow this time, but from the overwhelming power of it. The spirits spoke together. You have been starved by cruelty but fed by the unseen. What they withheld from you will return multiplied. What they mocked will be their undoing. At midnight your hunger will end, not with food but with power. Those words echoed in her mind even after the voices faded, and she knew with unshakable certainty that the path of her life had shifted. She was no longer merely a starving girl, hidden and forgotten. She was being prepared, molded in silence and darkness, by forces greater than her stepmother's cruelty. Her hunger had sharpened her spirit like a blade, and the whispers of the spirits were the hammer striking it into form. Lying there, frail but no longer afraid, she finally understood. Her suffering was not the end. It was the beginning of something her enemies could never anticipate. Every night of denial had been a lesson, every pang of hunger a teacher, and every tear a seed watered by the spirits themselves. The whispers had awakened her, and the visions promised what was to come. By midnight, her hunger would not break her, it would transform her into the nightmare of her enemies. Her body, once frail and starved, began to shift in the silence of midnight as though an invisible hand reshaped her bones, her blood, her very essence. The gnawing emptiness in her stomach twisted into something unrecognizable, no longer weakness but a furnace of power. Her ribs, which once pressed against her thin skin, now seemed to expand with every breath, as if she carried a storm within her chest. Her eyes, hollowed by days of denial, flickered like twin embers. Then, in a sudden blaze, they burned with a glow that was neither human nor earthly, a light that pierced darkness and silenced the whispers of night. Those eyes alone, had anyone dared to meet them, would have sent terror down their spine. Her voice, too, was no longer the trembling plea of a hungry girl. When she whispered, the sound resonated like an echo from a cave, layered with tones not her own, as if countless spirits spoke through her, each syllable a judgment, each breath a warning. Even she was startled by the sound, but it filled her with the certainty that she was no longer merely herself. The hunger that once kept her silent now gave her words the weight of thunder. Around her the air thickened. A strange aura enveloped her, shimmering faintly as though the unseen world pressed closer to her skin. It was as if her suffering had been gathered, molded, and then unleashed as energy. The ground beneath her bare feet pulsed softly, shadows lengthened unnaturally, and the walls that once confined her trembled. Her presence became unbearable to the timid, for even the night seemed to recoil in awe and fear. She was no longer simply a girl, she had become the vessel of something vast and merciless. Memories of her tormentors sharpened within her. Her stepmother's cruel laughter, her step-siblings' mocking smiles, the villagers who turned away from her hunger. Each memory flared like fuel inside her, intensifying the fire that now roared where her frailty had been. Her body, though still slight, carried itself with a power that seemed to bend the air around her. Every movement of her hand left behind a faint ripple of energy, like the wake of unseen waters. The hunger that had once gnawed at her gut now radiated outward, an aura of dread that clung to everything near. It was no longer a plea for food but a hunger for balance, for justice, for retribution. She felt her bones strengthen, her muscles coil with hidden force. Her once trembling legs stood steady as pillars. Her back, once bowed with despair, straightened like a tree nourished by lightning. The girl who had been denied bread had become a figure that even nightmares would hesitate to approach. In her transformation, the world itself seemed to recognize her power. Wind slipped through cracks though no storm raged outside. Flames from distant hearths dimmed as if in reverence or fear. Dogs howled in the far village, sensing something beyond human comprehension had awakened. The spirits who had whispered before now surged through her veins, their voices merging with her heartbeat, urging her toward the justice she had been promised. She looked at her reflection in a shard of broken pottery on the ground and almost did not recognize herself. Her face bore the same features, yet sharpened, more defined, her eyes glowing with a light that made her seem both divine and dreadful. The girl who once cried in silence had become the embodiment of her enemy's deepest fears. She was a warning in flesh, a shadow dressed in the remnants of innocence. Her hunger had been her downfall, but in this transformation, it became her weapon. She no longer longed for bread or mercy, she longed for reckoning. The frail child who had been mocked was gone. In her place stood a being both mortal and more than mortal, carrying the whispers of spirits, the fury of hunger, and the strength of darkness transformed into lightless power. Those who denied her food had unknowingly fed something greater, something that would soon rise against them. It began subtly, like the creeping chill of a wind before a storm, but soon it was undeniable. The household that had once mocked and starved her no longer felt safe, even within its sturdy walls. At first, her stepmother brushed it aside, strange drafts, misplaced objects, spoiled meals, but as the nights grew heavier and the shadows stretched longer, unease sank its claws into them. The girl's transformation was not only of body and spirit, it seeped outward into the world around her, twisting reality into a reflection of her tormentor's guilt. One morning, the stepmother prepared a feast, laying out platters meant for herself and her children. But when she lifted the first bite to her lips, the meat turned foul, maggots writhing where moments before there had been tender flesh. The bread, once warm and golden, crumbled into dust in her hands. The water she poured thickened like blood before her eyes. Panicked, she tried to hide it from her children, but they too gagged as their cups turned bitter and their plates spoiled before they could taste them. Food, the very thing they had hoarded so cruelly, betrayed them. What they had denied her now refused to sustain them. Objects in the house no longer stayed where they were placed. At night, clay pots rolled across the floor, spoons clattered on their own, and doors creaked open though no hand touched them. The step-siblings awoke to find their beds shifted, their blankets torn off, or their clothes scattered. They whispered among themselves, frightened but unwilling to admit the truth aloud, that the girl they had starved was not gone, that her presence moved with the shadows. The nights grew worse. Whispers slithered through the darkness, never clear, always just out of reach, yet sharp enough to gnaw at their minds. Sometimes it was her voice, trembling yet filled with an echo that no longer belonged to a mortal girl. At other times it was a chorus, spirits murmuring curses, riddles, promises of vengeance. The children huddled together, covering their ears, but the whispers seemed to come from within the walls, the roof, even the ground beneath them. Sleep became impossible, even silence carried the weight of her breath. The villagers too began to sense something amiss. They avoided the house when the sun dipped below the horizon. Some swore they heard crying from within the walls, not of a child but of countless unseen voices. Others claimed they saw shadows moving across the windows, tall and misshapen, though no one was inside. Mothers pulled their children closer when passing by, and men walked quickly, refusing to meet each other's eyes. The house that had once brimmed with cruel laughter was now marked by an unseen terror, cursed by the very soul they had all chosen to ignore. One night, as the stepmother tried to light a lamp, the flames sputtered and died again and again. Her hands shook, the wick crumbled, and the air grew so heavy she could not breathe. In the darkness, she heard her own name whispered from behind her, though when she spun around, no one stood there. Her children clutched at her, their eyes wide with terror, insisting they felt cold fingers brush their skin. Fear began to gnaw at her, the kind of fear that does not leave even in daylight. The cruelty they had dealt out so easily now circled back to them, piece by piece. Every corner of the house reminded them of her absence, and her presence. The empty mat where she had once lain seemed to shift with shadows that breathed. The clay bowl she used to beg scraps from rattled without being touched. At night, the air filled with the sound of footsteps pacing slowly, deliberately, though no one was walking. Their neighbors began to whisper too, not the ghostly murmurs of spirits but human tongues spreading rumor and suspicion. The girl's spirit haunts them, some said. The ancestors have cursed them, others declared. Whether living or dead, the girl had become inescapable. The stepmother tried to deny it, to curse loudly into the night, to demand silence from the shadows. But the louder she shouted, the louder the whispers grew, curling around her voice until she could not hear her own words. Food rotted in her storage pots, the walls groaned as if they carried unbearable weight, and even the chickens in her yard refused to lay eggs. The life she had built on cruelty was unraveling strand by strand. Her children clung to her, too afraid to sleep alone, too weak from spoiled meals to play or laugh. They began to dread the sound of midnight, when the air shifted and shadows seemed to crawl from the corners. They spoke of seeing her eyes, glowing in the dark even when they were shut tight. They screamed of her hand reaching for them, though no one else could see it. Fear had become their constant companion. The girl they had starved had become more than hunger, she was the hunger in their souls, gnawing from within, stripping away peace and leaving only terror. By midnight none of them felt safe. They lived in the prison they had once made for her, and with each passing night, they realized the truth. Their victim was no longer powerless. She had become the nightmare they could not escape. The night they had all feared finally arrived, though none of them could name the moment it began. The air in the village turned thick and unmoving, as though the wind itself had decided to hold its breath. Dogs howled without reason, goats bleated frantically, and the elders who watched the moon said it glowed too red, as though stained by blood. In the stepmother's house, unease crawled over the walls like ivy, wrapping itself around every breath her family took. Sleep was impossible. The children tossed and turned, their bellies gnawed by hunger, their dreams filled with shadows that pressed too close. The stepmother sat by the dying fire, her eyes darting at every sound, every flicker, every whisper she could not place. She tried to hum to herself, but her own voice cracked and betrayed the trembling in her chest. Then just past midnight the silence broke. A knock came at the door, slow and deliberate. Not the hurried tapping of a neighbor, but the heavy, hollow thud of something not bound by flesh. The stepmother froze. Her children clung to her legs, whispering, "Don't open it." She didn't. But the door opened on its own, swinging wide without a hand, revealing only the night beyond. The fire in the hearth guttered and died, plunging the room into shadows. From that darkness, shapes began to emerge, at first only faint flickers, then growing clearer, gaunt figures with hollow eyes, outlines of faces the villagers had long buried, ancestors wronged and restless. They filled the house, their presence suffocating, their eyes glowing faintly with the same fire the girl now carried in her veins. The children screamed, but no sound seemed to leave their throats. The stepmother tried to stand, but her legs buckled as her own name was whispered by 100 unseen voices at once. And then she appeared. Not weak, not starving, not broken as they had left her. The girl stood in the doorway, her body draped in shadows that moved like a living cloak. Her eyes burned with an otherworldly light, piercing through the darkness, fixing her stepmother in place. Her voice, when she spoke, was both hers and not hers, layered with the echoes of spirits who had come to stand beside her. "You refused me food," she said, each word heavy, echoing as though spoken by a crowd. "Now you will know hunger that no feast can cure." The room shifted with her words. The stepmother's table, once stacked with hoarded meals, rattled violently. Clay pots burst open, spilling dust where there had once been grain. The children reached for fruit in desperation, only to find it crumbling into ash in their hands. They clawed at their throats, choking as though even air had turned against them. The stepmother wailed, begging forgiveness, but the whispers of the spirits drowned her pleas, chanting her sins back to her: cruelty, envy, betrayal. As the girl stepped further into the house, shadows moved with her. They coiled around the step-siblings, pinning them to the floor, forcing their eyes open so they could not look away. The girl raised her hand and visions swam before them, not of the present, but of every moment they had mocked her hunger, every bite they had taken while she wept in silence. The scenes played like fire across the walls, the laughter, the cruelty, the denial. The children screamed for the visions to stop, but their own voices mocked them back, repeating every word they had ever spoken in malice. The stepmother tried to crawl toward the door, but it slammed shut with a force that cracked the frame. She turned back, trembling, and saw her late husband's face among the spirits, stern, disappointed, and silent. His gaze cut through her more deeply than the curses swirling in the air. She shrieked, covering her face, but there was no hiding from justice now. The girl stood tall, her voice low but unwavering. "You starved me of food, of love, of kindness. But I was not abandoned. The spirits fed me with fire, and now you will taste it." At her command, the fire pit roared back to life, but it was no ordinary flame. It burned black and blue, its heat searing though it consumed nothing physical. It was hunger itself, the same gnawing void they had forced upon her, now alive and merciless. The stepmother clutched her belly, crying out as though something inside her clawed for release. Her children writhed on the ground, begging for mercy, their faces pale with terror. Outside, villagers gathered, drawn by the screams. But when they peered into the windows they froze. They did not see a frail girl avenging herself, they saw a figure radiant with power, surrounded by spirits, her very presence bending the air. Some fell to their knees, convinced they were witnessing divine judgment. Others ran, unwilling to meet the eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. The stepmother sobbed, clawing at the floor, trying to crawl toward the girl. "Forgive me," she gasped. "I was blind. I was cruel," but the girl's expression did not soften. Her silence was heavier than any curse. The spirits moved closer, their whispers rising into a roar, filling the house with a sound like thunder, like drums of war. The torment had only begun. That night became legend, the night when a starving girl returned not as a victim but as a storm of justice. It was said that the stepmother's cries echoed long after the flames died, that the house itself carried the stench of ash and fear for years. And it was said that those who witnessed it never forgot the look in the girl's eyes, nor the truth that cruelty feeds its own destruction. Justice did not fall like a single stone, it spread like ripples, touching every soul who had taken part in her suffering. That night, after the cries of the stepmother and her children had shaken the walls, silence came. But it was not peace. It was the silence of something broken, of judgment having already chosen its course. The villagers, huddled outside in dread, waited with pounding hearts. They had seen the girl glowing with the power of spirits, her eyes blazing like the embers of a fire that never died. They had seen her stepmother crawling, begging, shrieking. They had heard curses spoken in voices that were not human, promises of hunger, madness, and ruin. And then the spirits themselves had sealed the house in darkness. When the doors finally opened again, the villagers dared to step closer, their bodies trembling. The stepmother and her children stumbled out, but they were not the same. Their eyes had lost all light, haunted, hollow, as though they had stared too long into a void that revealed every cruelty they had ever committed. The stepmother clutched her stomach, groaning as though a beast gnawed at her from within. She clawed at the ground, muttering broken words, repeating the girl's name with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Her children wept without reason, swatting at invisible hands tugging at their clothes, wailing that whispers followed them even in silence. Some said it was madness. Others said the spirits had marked them, stripping away every comfort they had stolen from the girl. Food spoiled when they touched it. Water turned bitter in their mouths. No fire would warm them, no bed would soften beneath them. Wherever they walked, shadows stretched too long, curling at their feet like chains. They were alive but condemned, captive to a torment no human hand could undo. The villagers whispered that this was worse than death, a punishment without end crafted by justice itself. The girl, however, stood tall, unbroken, her frame glowing faintly as though the fire of the ancestors still lived within her. She looked upon her tormentors not with hatred but with the stillness of one who had seen beyond mortal limits. "Let them carry what they gave," she said, her voice calm yet resonant, and the spirits around her stirred like wind through trees. Those words sealed their fate. From that day on, the stepmother and her children were cast out. None dared offer them shelter, for every hut they entered grew cold, every meal rotted, every roof cracked open in the night. They wandered, cursed and despised, until their names became a warning. Do not deny kindness, for cruelty returns tenfold. The villagers, shaken by what they had witnessed, turned their eyes to the girl. Once mocked, once pitied, once ignored, she now stood as proof that innocence is not weakness, that the unseen world watches and remembers. Elders murmured proverbs that spread like fire across the land. Hunger denied is fire awakened. Mothers warned their children, do not laugh at the weak, for the spirits may laugh last. Fear lingered, yes, but so did awe. The villagers realized that justice was not random, it was rooted in balance, in the truth that cruelty brings ruin while the innocent, though silent for a time, are always avenged. They began to treat one another differently. Food was shared more freely, kindness became a duty rather than an option. Even the harshest men glanced over their shoulders when tempted toward selfishness, remembering the girl's burning eyes. The stepmother's fall was complete. Where she once sat in pride, hoarding and mocking, she now wandered in rags, her voice breaking into incoherent babbles. The children who had once sneered at their stepsister became shadows of themselves, trembling at every sound. Villagers said they saw them whispering to empty air, begging unseen spirits to stop the laughter only they could hear. Their cruelty had not been forgotten, it had been engraved into their lives as torment, a living record of their sins. And the girl? She did not chase them nor strike them down further. She had no need. Justice had already done what her hands could not. Instead, she lifted her head toward the night sky, the spirit's glow softening into a warmth that wrapped her like a cloak. She was no longer hungry, not for food, not for love, not for recognition. What she carried now was far greater, the proof that her pain had meaning, that her suffering had awakened power beyond imagination, and that she would never again be denied her place in the world. The villagers bowed to her, some weeping, some trembling, some whispering prayers of gratitude. They had seen cruelty undone, power reversed, and innocence crowned with strength. In their eyes, the girl was no longer just one of them. She was chosen, touched by forces that made even the boldest bow in respect. And as they knelt, as they whispered her name in reverence, the girl understood that her justice was not only for herself. It was for every hungry child, every mocked soul, every silenced heart. She had become the vessel of their vindication. Thus justice was delivered. Not in the swift stroke of vengeance, but in the slow, unending torment of those who had wronged her, and in the lasting memory of the villagers who would never again take cruelty lightly. Her story spread, and with it the eternal truth. The world may allow injustice for a time, but the balance will always return. And when it does, the oppressors fall, and the innocent rise glowing with the light of the spirits. The dawn came quietly, but it carried with it a weight that pressed upon every heart in the village. The first rays of sunlight fell across the land, painting the huts and the dusty ground in gold. Yet no one looked to the rising sun that morning. Their eyes were fixed on the girl who stood in the center of the square, her presence brighter than the day itself. Where once they had seen a frail, hungry child with hollow cheeks and eyes heavy with sorrow, now they beheld a figure transformed. Her body carried the scars of deprivation, but they no longer looked like signs of weakness. Instead, they marked her as one who had endured, who had suffered, and who had risen unbroken. Whispers spread through the crowd, each voice uncertain, wavering between fear and reverence. Some called her blessed by the spirits, others said she was a walking curse against cruelty. But all agreed on one thing: she was no longer the girl they had mocked, denied, and starved. She had become something more, something untouchable. Her gaze carried the weight of justice, her every breath seemed to echo with the whispers of unseen forces. When she looked upon someone, they felt stripped bare, their sins exposed as though the spirits themselves watched through her eyes. The elders approached her cautiously, bending their heads, speaking in tones laced with awe. "Child of hunger no more," one of them murmured, "you carry the fire of balance within you." The villagers knelt, not because they were commanded, but because something in her presence compelled submission. She had walked through the shadows of suffering and returned not as a victim, but as a protector who carried both mercy and vengeance in equal measure. Her suffering became legend even as the story was still unfolding. Parents held their children close, whispering the tale, how she had been denied food, how hunger had nearly broken her, and how at midnight the spirits had answered her pain with power. They would tell it again and again, each time with trembling voices, teaching their children never to mock weakness, never to starve the helpless, never to mistake silence for surrender. The girl's life had become a mirror in which the village saw its own cruelty reflected, and in that reflection they trembled. But while fear spread, so too did respect. Those who had once turned away from her cries now stepped forward, bringing offerings of food, water, and gifts. Not because she asked, not because she hungered anymore, for it was clear she no longer needed what they offered, but because they longed for her forgiveness, for some sign that the spirits chosen would look kindly upon them. When she accepted nothing, only smiling faintly, they understood that her power was beyond barter. She had risen above need, and in that rise she had become eternal. The girl's hunger was no longer the hollow ache of an empty stomach. It had been transformed into a different kind of fire, one that fueled her spirit, one that would never again be quenched by cruelty. Where others saw pain, she carried strength. Where others saw weakness, she bore resilience. That transformation frightened the guilty, but it inspired the innocent. Those who had known their own quiet sufferings, orphans, widows, the overlooked, the mocked, looked at her and saw hope. They saw proof that suffering could become power, that silence could speak louder than cruelty, that the broken could rise to protect. Her stepmother and tormentors, already cursed by their madness and exile, lingered on the edges of memory, their downfall part of the tale. They were no longer feared, they were examples. What endured was not their cruelty but the girl's survival, her glowing defiance that had rewritten the story of the village forever. Even as her enemies' names faded into whispers of warning, her own name became etched in every heart. To speak it was to call upon resilience, to remind oneself that justice would always come, even if delayed. As the day spread across the land, the girl stood unmoving, her figure framed by the morning light. Children gathered near her feet, not afraid but filled with wonder. Women wept softly, seeing in her their own hidden strength. Men bowed their heads, ashamed of their silence but grateful for the chance to change. She had become the measure of justice, the protector who did not need weapons, whose very presence was a shield for the weak and a curse for the cruel. Her story was already becoming legend, but legends never sleep. They grow, they spread, they root themselves in the soil of memory. And so, the girl's hunger was remembered not as tragedy, but as transformation. Her weakness became her crown. Her denial became her ascension. By dawn she was not merely a survivor, she was a symbol, feared and revered, forever carrying the spirit's power to protect, to judge, and to inspire. The villagers knew then that the dawn had not just brought light to the land. It had brought them a protector, a reminder, and a living legend whose presence would echo through generations. And as the sun climbed higher, one truth was etched into every heart. The girl who had once been starved now stood as eternal strength, a flame that no cruelty could ever extinguish.